Good morning, folks. My name is Ted, and you are watching the Business of Cyber series, where we talk about resources. There aren't enough of them out there, which means you have to make great, solid, trustworthy decisions about how you use them. We're talking about people, we're talking about process, and we're talking about technology. Welcome to the Business of Cyber show. This is episode 12. Super excited to talk about audits versus assessments. This has been a discussion on LinkedIn that I've seen happen over the course of the last couple months, where people are in the critical infrastructure sectors are starting to ask themselves, do I have enough technology? Do I have the best processes? How do I build a better team? And so naturally, there are a ton of assessments that are taking place within the critical infrastructure cyber sectors. There's a ton of audits that are happening. We have regulatory pressures coming down from all of Europe. We have regulatory pressures coming down on pipeline industry. We have regulatory pressures coming down on publicly owned companies via the SEC. And so what people are constantly doing, and we've talked about this on the show, is that non-technical leaders are placing more pressure on CISOs and CIOs, but they're not matching the resources all the time. And so that's a really challenging position to be in. And so these assessments or these audits, those terms are generally loosely used in the industry. It's a major talking point. And what we wanted to do today is we wanted to dive into what are the differences between audits and assessments, and what are the real definitions. Is it based on region? Is it based on experience? Is it based on sector? This is something that is near and dear to my heart as an auditor for Shell in my past life. But today I thought, instead of me doing another show on audits and assessments with just my own personal perspective, we're joined by somebody that I'm super excited to introduce, Mr. John Kingsley from the other side of the world, from India. John, welcome to the Business of Cyber show, and thank you for investing the time to share your thoughts.
Thank you, Ted. It's really nice to be here and speak with you on the one of my favorite topics. As you know, I just posted on LinkedIn and it kind of blew up, and that's how we met. And we thought we should do a session on this to clear up some of our understandings, doubts, clarifications, and also learn something from the process.
Well, I thought it was funny. So here's the real story for folks on how we met. First and foremost, John, I'll give you an opportunity before we go further. John, let me tell them a story, then I'll let you introduce yourself kind of professionally. I gave a Business of podcast series on audits versus assessment because it's something that I'm passionate about, right? And I had a certain perspective. Well, I started following Mr. Kingsley, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 months ago. He's got 14,000 followers on LinkedIn, which, let me tell you, if you get past the 10,000 mark, it's not easy to do. This isn't Instagram, TikTok, or any of that. People, especially if you don't allow people to follow you that aren't in your space. So for anybody watching, I think John is somebody you absolutely have to follow. He always has amazing content. And so I'm just scrolling on LinkedIn one day, and here's a piece of content that says audits versus assessments. What is the real truth, right? And so the expanded view, I almost felt like there was kind of a twin on the other side of the world speaking this. So I just reached out and I said, hey, you want to do a podcast on this? And we're excited to talk a little bit about today about how we might have some, similar or contrasting views. We'll get to that in a minute. John, take a moment, tell the viewers out there kind of what you do on a regular basis. What are the challenges you're seeing out there? What are some of your experience levels so that they can understand your perspective and where you come from?
Sure. I'm based in India, Chennai, and I have around 17 years of overall experience in the OT systems. Worked in multiple industrial sectors: oil and gas, petrochemical, refining, manufacturing, bit of consulting, tender management, and so on. So, being from the OT background and transitioning into OT cybersecurity, I used to work with a lot of standards in terms of supporting auditors and assessors, right? Because the previous company that I used to work with, they mainly did all these third-party studies, and that's how I cut my teeth in the OT cybersecurity and slowly transitioned into the cybersecurity of the OT. And currently, I work with Hitachi Energy as a product security engineer, and also deal with developing and implementing cybersecurity solutions for our products.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. So, first thing that we'll jump into is this idea of audit versus assessment. We don't have a ton of slides today, folks, but I thought it would be Let me slide over here. Let me just move some slides around, folks. I thought what would be interesting is just diving into uh, a little bit on audits or assessments. And what we did today is we put together a little bit of a game board. Now, this is something that we haven't done in the past because we don't have tons of slides to run through. But as John and I collaborated prior to this call, we were throwing a bunch of ideas out. And the ideas were, what's the difference in an audit and an assessment? The idea was, what are the various kind of thought processes that go into an audit versus an assessment? And the more that we talked, we recognized that the best way to really stay on track and give the audience a good understanding of the vast components of an audit and assessment is just to lay it all out. So what you see here is starting on the top left of this table, you've got the definition, the standards, the prerequisite, the where, the why, the who, the how, the when. What are the next steps, desired end state? You say to yourself, what are those things? Well, from our collective vantage point, these are some of the basic milestones that you're going to be thinking about, or you should be thinking about when you're going to do an audit or an assessment. And John, if you could kick us off and just walk us through this general order of events, maybe 30 seconds to a minute on each of them, I'd really
Sure.
like the audience to understand from your perspective what it takes to do a great assessment or an audit, and then we'll jump into jumping around on the game board a little bit.
Right. So let me start with the definition, right? I think even though we have standards, various standards that talk about audit and assessment, it's still quite subjective. Just based on my experience in the industry as well as the comments that I saw in the post. But to give a very quick overview of what an audit is, it's basically to make an official examination of the quality or condition of something, right? And it's normally done through a procedure or having some kind of management system in place by developing policies, procedures, and how to go about it. And at the end of it, it culminates as a report, right? So when we specifically speak about cybersecurity audit, it's a comprehensive review of the overall organization's infrastructure, and these could be IT as well as OT. And IT, especially, we all know these are governed by standards such as ISO 27001 and various other industry specific standards that are actually put in place, right? And based on that, there are various management systems also developed. And of course, OT, uh, the gold standard for OT is IEC 6443. But again, this is something very new, and not many people are aware how to go about to develop an OT CSMS. And the overall goal is to identify the vulnerabilities that we have, right? Like which could lead to some kind of cyber attack or a breach, and that's why we have these management systems. And the ultimate aim of the audit is to understand all these deficiencies and try to rectify it. That's very briefly when we talk about audit. And of course, there are more that we can go when we speak out of the other topics that are listed here. So let's quickly uh, speak about what an assessment is. So when we compare with the audit, this is quite interchangeably or loosely used. That shouldn't be done. Assessment is a very specific meaning, where it's an act of making a judgment about something or someone, right? Uh, Generally speaking, and it could also mean an idea or an opinion about something. So, when we speak about the cybersecurity, the context here is usually doing a risk assessment, basically identifying, analyzing, and evaluating risk. And there are, of course, different types of assessment when we talk about that. And another challenge from my personal experience in the industry is people confuse assessing or assessment with testing. Probably that is something that needs to be highlighted. Both are not the same, right? And this is something that I thought I should definitely share here.
Yeah, I totally agree. The idea that, I think it's regional, right? So some people view an audit as a very compliance oriented, very specific evaluation of a given organization, let's say, or a process or a people to a standard, whereas an assessment is a little bit more holistic, maybe not as holistic and maybe more focused. So The way that I look at it is there's a process, or there should be a process for an audit or an assessment that starts with a definition. You've got to map whatever you're going to audit or assess to a standard. You mentioned 62443 as a really great risk assessment. You're pulling in different threat capabilities. You're putting in risk matrices. That's very different than, let's say, an ISO based audit where you shall do this. You may be if auditing more than just a system or people. You may be auditing the actual relative capability of an organization to respond to things. But once you define that standard, then we get into prerequisites, you get into scope. Let's stay real quick right now on the standards part. One of the things
Right.
that we talked about is that we put a lower look for the audience, the dollar values on the right-hand side. We try to do a little bit of a Jeopardy board
Correct.
with one perspective in mind. We put a higher dollar value on a given grid that we think is harder to answer. Now, let me take the first crack at it, John, and then you see if you can,
Sure.
balance out my perspective.
Sure.
If you're
Yeah.
going to do an assessment, you can choose a standard, you can choose a framework, you can choose something from NIST, you can choose IEC, you can choose a homegrown version. Where I think assessments fall is, as far as these standards are concerned, is that there's a ton of standards. That's why we put it really low. The real question is, what do you want to assess and what are you looking to assess it to? If you're doing a threat assessment, a gap assessment, if you're doing a controls assessment, well, then you're going to use controls-based frameworks like a NIST. If you're doing a risk assessment, then you need to go to a 62443 and use some sort of risk methodology. If you are doing a technical assessment, maybe that's a vulnerability assessment, maybe that's a penetration test, then that is even a different category. So we put $25 in there because there's a lot of standards to choose from. Now, when you try to apply that same methodology to an audit, I think it gets more challenging, John. I think it's challenging to audit to a known standard because that known standard has to be extremely well defined. That standard has to be extremely readily available to the entire organization, because you wouldn't want to audit an organization or a facility to a known standard if they didn't have access to it. So that's my particular argument, that choosing a standard is actually a little bit more difficult in an audit than you would say an assessment. What say you, John?
Um, I partially agree with that. Uh, of course, see, IT security is comparatively matured when we compare to OT cybersecurity, and there is another challenge that I see is um, sometimes compliance is confused with assessment, and that should not be the case, right? And uh, when we speak about assessment, especially in terms of OT cybersecurity, it's basically the risk assessment, and these are often combined with vulnerability assessments. So I think that's where the challenge lies, right? These are not regulations yet. These are just standards that could be voluntarily complied. So there is a lot of confusion and some kind of tailor-made approach in terms of going about the assessments. What is the risk management that is used? See, when we talk about risk management in the context of risk assessment, using the right risk management framework is a challenge. IEC 62443 points to a certain way of doing it, but there are many other methods of identifying the risk. So probably that is the reason why we have put a so low value over here. I think this is something that is very subjective and needs to be identified in terms of what do they really want to do, right?
Yeah. Well, you bring up a great point. So let's jump to preparation. Let's jump to two things: prerequisite as well as the preparation. Now, you and I put the who as part of the preparation. I think there's a lot more than just the who, but if we tied prerequisite and who, um, you actually see audit being a higher number. And our perspective there was that the prerequisite for an audit is different than an assessment. We think audits are more
Correct.
encompassing generally.
Correct.
You've got to have more than just a standards expert. One of the gentlemen on the call today actually just mentioned that you should have an SME for that particular capability, maybe that OT system, maybe that facility, rather than just a standards expert. Couldn't agree more, especially when you're
True.
auditing. Now,
True.
so you have to have some element of a training. You have to have some level of an expertise. And that's usually where the first mistake, I think, is made by asset owners. You had shared with me in our pre-call that a lot of challenges you're seeing in the industry is that people want to kind of assess themselves. Where do you draw the line on assessing yourself versus auditing yourself, right? So I'll take the first crack at it. If you're going to be very effective in an assessment, I do believe that you can bring in your own personnel to assess something, whether that's a system you're assessing to a known standard, whether that is a capability on the people of the process side. Because in the assessment realm, I think control gaps. I think that you're assessing yourself to verify, do I have a control in place? If I don't have a control in place, do I have some mitigating measures that are in place? Do I have some layered defense in place? Because my job is to assess this. Now, do I believe that on the prerequisite side and the preparation of the who, that you should audit yourself as an internal group? I think the answer is it depends. So I come from a background where I was at the operator level and I was an auditor, but I actually was deployed as a corporate resource to different organizations, both internal and external to the group. If you are a 14-person security team, I would say that you should not audit yourselves. But if you had someone from a separate division audit you to a known internal standard, I think that would be okay. It gets a little more challenging when you're, in my book, when you're looking at the word audit versus assessment, because assessment, you're trying to say, do I have this in place? Right? Do I have that control in place? Do I have a pen in my hand? Is that pen black and does it weigh a certain amount? I believe that the difference between an assessment and an audit, John, is that an audit will do all the same things that an assessment did, but it's also going to ask a very particular question. And that is, does it write well? That's subjective. And so in order for an audit to really be an audit instead of just an assessment, my take is you have to have somebody with a level of experience and a level of fundamental SME knowledge of how that business operates, that they're actually able to say, not only do we have the controls in place, but the controls are effective. What say you, John?
Um, um, See, um, ideally, yes, but the challenge here is, uh, of course, it's two pronged, right? Like, um, first we need to have a baseline. We need to know what is our existing state, and uh, some people say it could be an overall audit. Some people could say it's an internal assessment that is done, right? So I do agree we need third party specialists who are knowledgeable that the team may not have. And one recurrent theme or thing that I keep seeing in my practice earlier was people going into a checklist mentality, right? and
Right.
and that's what differentiates an audit versus an assessment. I personally believe that assessments should be done by subject matter experts, um, who have a long-standing experience doing the system integration or the commissioning and so on, and also have a wide-ranging experience in terms of implementing the cybersecurity controls. So that's where I am coming from.
Yeah. Yeah. See, in my world, you can take an assessment. I actually think our view of us of audit is different. So let me see if I'm right. We agree that a checklist mentality is not going to be as effective as a true evaluation mentality. We agree on this, right?
Yeah.
Um, so in different sectors and in different regions, I just want to ask, does an audit in the world you operate in mean checklist that you're auditing to a, let's say, a compliance standard and you're verifying something exists, at least most of the time?
Yes, unfortunately, that's the case. That's how it is being done. And whenever one prepares for an organization wide audit from external parties, people do an internal audit, right? And they just see if things are there in place in terms of all the controls, in terms of all the mitigation, uh, but don't go into much depth, right? And this is where
Right.
a need of an assessment that is very specific in nature of each systems, based on the requirements, probably can highlight what is happening. Okay, they might have, during an audit people might find some deficiencies or something being missed out, but they may not be able to isolate or understand what exactly is the technical deficiency. It could be a vulnerability, it could be a backdoor, we wouldn't know.
Yeah, it makes sense. So I actually believe regionally there's differences there. So here's in my experience what I've seen, right? You do an assessment to evaluate whether something is present. You can go a step deeper and evaluate whether, I guess you could do a check the block assessment, and you could do an assessment to a compliance standard. So I would flip them. When I think of an audit, I think SME, I think very expansive, I think holistic. But in my perspective, you take the assessment data, and the audit is there to validate essentially the value of that data. So back to my scenario with a pen, I would assess whether the pen can write. I would assess whether the pen is functional. I would audit whether or not it is functional to a given standard that I define. So I actually believe that audit, and you and I might be just on opposite ends here, which is very important for the audience to understand that different regions might view these words differently. I view the assessment as the collection of data, whether they're technical or a gap assessment with human, and you use that data to set the baseline foundation of here's what my overall cybersecurity risk posture or controls posture looks like. And then
Right.
less frequently, the audit would come in to say, okay, well, we took a look at all this, but let's let's use the audit to really challenge the assessment data. What do you That's where I think, in my experience, at least primarily working in the US, North America region, that's where I've seen audit and assessment kind of trade.
Yeah. Uh, so see, when you put it that way, I cannot disagree with that. I think it sounds very logical, but but is that really happening? So that is my question here. And earlier we spoke about the competency, we spoke about the knowledge. Uh, I think th- these are the key challenges that crops up, right? uh, Audit could be done, but is the assessment accurate? How do we know that? uh, with the people churn that is happening, and with the demand in terms of experienced professionals who are knowledgeable, I think this could be a potential gap that I see. And whatever non-conformances that we see, um, whether the management of change was done, was there a rectification undertaken, how we improved, or what were the improvements done. I think on a holistic level, of course, an audit captures that, but I always feel that there is a significant challenge here.
We've got a we've got a comment. Our discussion is driving a lot of comments, which I think is good. Here's what I can say right now. I think you're right, and I wouldn't say that I'm right, but I think that my differing perspective is valid in the industry. Like, there honestly is not a wrong answer. I think the only wrong answer is we're not doing any of them, right? I think the
True.
right answer is, are we applying the right resources to it, right? So I wanted to make a comment. One gentleman said that I liked. He wrote a comment. And he said, "Look, you give me 100 SMEs, and you're going to have 110 different ways of doing it." And
True.
I couldn't agree more. I think that you and I are showcasing that. Um, let's move to a different component of the board here.
Yeah.
Um,
Just
Which one would
quickly,
you like
since
to
you,
talk about?
yeah, sorry, Ted, since you uh, spoke about this 101 ways to go. See, uh, when we talk about audit, people always think, right, like there is a need of proof and so on. But when we go with the assessment, it's always the subject matter experts word for it, and we just go ahead with it. There is no second guessing or no verification that happens. So that again is like a challenge, right? Like uh,
It is a challenge. We even had somebody say, introduce the idea of a pre-audit assessment as if we could combine the two. And I totally agree. If you're going to do a really great audit, you're going to actually assess a lot of the previous documentation. That may take a week sometimes. That may take 3 or 4 days, which is why I think it is important to have some level of a scalable repository for previous assessment data to
true.
accelerate the audit function. Because just one final piece on the who, would you not agree, John, that if you're going to have an audit, you should have a regular rotation of people? I'm of the belief that service company should come in and do an audit in 2023, and then we should not renew that contract, not because we didn't like the results, but we need a fresh set of eyes because of the nature of the subjectivity of said audit, right?
Yes, I think uh, this is quite harder to implement for various reasons, but it is always helpful to get a fresh set of eyes. But I'm not sure if it is practically feasible for
Right.
various
Right.
reasons.
Right. Well, let's jump to one of the ones that I think always challenges security and risk management leaders, which is the budget. Let's talk a little bit about, we talked about the differences between assessment and audit. Um, we, and I'll take the first crack at it. Simply put, in critical infrastructure, specifically for OT, you are going to have a better chance at getting budget from your ops, security, from your governance, from anybody, if you can map the value of the assessment or the audit back to business outcomes. The favorite two for me are safety and non-productive time, which are essentially one and the same, because if things shut down due to a safety incident, that's non-productive time. It's kind of a double whammy. If you get shut down from, you know, your robotics going down, or you're taking machines offline, or you're taking some sort of system offline, then obviously that's non-productive time. Um, so I would always stress the importance, if you're going to really understand the why, you have, well, if you're going to be successful, you have to understand the why. You have to communicate to the why. Do you agree? And what are some examples of when people got that either really right or they got it really wrong as it relates to the budget, John?
Okay, so honestly, this is a very divisive topic. Be it India, be it anywhere across the world, I think this is a particular challenge. Management, they always see the business objective, right? And what you're saying definitely resonates with the management. But when we see it from a technical standpoint, uh, the moral and ethical question that one might have is, why is this need to be proved in that context? Why it needs to be paired in terms of revenue lost? Isn't it something that we need to do it mandatorily? Do we really need regulations for this? Don't we need the importance? Because this is something that we can learn from the safety standards that has evolved and matured over the years, and especially something like process safety or functional safety in the context of OT systems and the oil and gas industry, the petrochemical industry, because uh, they have various threats and risks, and for them, they have been doing that for a long time. And uh, cyber is another threat for them, right? So so I think we need a balance, right? We need some middle ground. It's not either you're right, I am wrong, I am right, you're wrong. We need to find a middle ground. And these standards, these rules, regulations, all of that to help us to get there. That's what I feel. There is no one right or wrong way to go about, but ultimately explaining and getting it across the management, getting the budget across is the key. But it shouldn't be done hook or crook way, because that might negate uh, uh, the the benefits later on. Because if there is a year or maybe 2 years without any incidents or attacks, that doesn't mean that we are 100% perfect, right? People might be already in the system, we do not know. So I always suggest people process technology, and people should be trained, they should have the right tools in their hand, and then only comes the next thing in terms of the technology or the hardware and solutions that go along with it.
Yeah. Look, I'm a believer that I wouldn't call it the low hanging fruit, but one of the most impactful things an organization can do is in the OT world is you've got to understand what you have with an asset inventory. You've got to be able to understand where your patching is deficient. Um, so I think for the last 4 to 6 years, I'm gonna get on the business of cyber for a second. All the investment dollars have really gone towards highly technical solutions to assess vulnerabilities or risks within technical solutions. Where I think the industry is lacking um, is on the audit and assessment side for people in process. Because the biggest challenge that I see, my day to day is talking to companies that are a little confused on their next steps. And they're using assessments to help guide their next steps. But the biggest challenge that I see is they've deployed technical solutions on the hope that vulnerability assessments, patch management, asset inventory are going to be the most important thing for them. But because they have not assessed and audited the processes and the people to drive the processes, they therefore are sitting on a massive wealth of information. Let's call it vulnerabilities. They don't have the process or the people to patch it. They don't have the alignment with the operational technology folks to understand that maintenance windows have to be followed in order to pull things offline. And so what we see is we see this massive shift where people are wanting to beef up their people and their process, and they're using these words. So, you know, this idea of people, process, and tech that you mentioned, it's important, John. And I think that you're right. It doesn't really matter which way you define audit or assessment. You've got to find you've got to define it well. You've got to define the why really well, and you've got to get your team together to assess yourselves effectively. And I think that as you go from sector to sector, region to region, experience level to experience level, you'll find thousands of right answers. Um, but we have a lot on our plate as an industry to progress forward as it relates to audits and assessments.
True. Just to add on what you had mentioned, I think, uh, irrespective of whatever we might disagree, I think this is something that I also 100% agree with you. It's this shiny factor syndrome or something, right? Like all this fancy hardware and software, with all the AI and machine learning will do all the magic. No, it doesn't work that way. People spend millions and millions and implement so many things, and after 3 years, 4 years, they realize uh, they do not know how to actually use and benefit from that. This is something that I see. I do not want to do any name calling here. I think that wouldn't be good. But I see this is the most problematic part of the industry. And you also mentioned, training the people, continuously making them aware, is what something that we need to do. And in the context of budget and the why, when we speak about audit, I think there's fair enough of information and support that is available. But when we speak about the assessment here, uh, we see the cost is basically almost the same. And I think the reason here is because uh, assessments, of course, uh, kind of imitate what audits do in a way, but in a more technical manner.
Yeah, it's I appreciate it. Back to your original point that you made previously, that shiny object, the ROI is what security and risk management leaders are struggling with. And I can see that one of the pushes, one of the reasons that audits and assessments are happening at a higher rate in the fall of 23 versus previous years is because CFOs, CIOs, digital transformation officers, people that have an eye on the bottom line are asking themselves one question. In a sea of evolving threats that we know is not going to stop, how do we make sure that we don't have a runaway train on our cyber budgets? I mean, who wants to just continually, I think the only companies on earth that want endless growth to cyber budgets are cyber vendors because, and we're even seeing that's not working out because the business side of cyber will prevail. And so I think the collective challenge that we have is not that we have too many vendors. It's not that we don't have enough technical solutions. It isn't even that we have too few SMEs. It's that we still have yet not mastered the art of selective control closure at a pace that our team can handle. That's the real challenge. And so where I think the biggest challenge that the industry has, John, is overwhelming CIOs, CISOs, and their direct reports. Is they're just loading on more work, and there's just not a value to why they're going to do that. So it's a different discussion. As we round out kind of third base here on our discussion, why don't we pick one more topics right here off the game board and dive into it? Which one do you
True.
think you want to cover?
I think preparation frequency kind of goes hand in hand in terms of the scope and what we want to achieve and so on. So I suppose execution and what are the next steps and what is the desired end state. These three could probably the
Let's
topics
do
that
it.
we speak about.
I'll offer a very basic perspective. Um, you said preparation frequency, right? I think that I wouldn't do audits more than a year, maybe even every 3 years, because I think they're so much larger. I would do assessments on the frequency. I would do assessments as often as there's a business change, especially in IT, or excuse me, OT. IT, it's kind of like, well, I'm going to do an annual assessment because I've been doing that forever. In OT, it's different. You may not even be able to access the site, both physically and technically, unless you follow some sort of downtime or maintenance window, right? Unless you have digital twins available, unless you have a separate part of the facility that you can tap into. So I think, at best, annually, maybe every 2 years on the assessment side, but I always argue you should do assessments when there is a change to the business that introduces a new threat in which a control is not present to reduce the overall risk to the organization. Different perspective, John, or
I have a different perspective here.
good?
Um, because I think 2 or 3 years in the technology arena might be just too long. The reason being, of course, the evolving threats and so on, that all is there, but we need to get up to the speed, right? And we need to improve our maturity. At the most, I think annual uh, audit followed by multiple internal assessments that could be quarterly, I think should be the way to go. And if you are an organization that has multiple manufacturing facilities and different IT organizations, probably your challenge is manifold. But this is not something that cannot be done with the right tools that help us to automate various aspects. I'm sure this can streamline and help people on the ground, right? uh, we just need to empower people on the execution part. But in terms of frequency, I suppose internal assessments every quarter and an overall audit annually.
Right. Yeah, good point. You bring up good points. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the asset owner has to define that, right? And they got to budget it too. I've always I think I did a blog piece like 2 or 3 years ago, and I said, don't do an assessment unless you already have planned in your budget after the assessment to either change, add, or configure different controls. And I think that's one of the challenges with the word assessment or audit is that someone tells us to do it for whatever reason. So it gets done. Whether it was a check the block activity or if it was really valuable is really irrelevant. The output of that goes and sits on somebody's desk. And because that risk owner didn't really drive the why, the changes are not going to get implemented. And that's that negative cycle of resource allocation that I see rampant in the industry. So I agree with your perspectives generally.
Right. See, Ted, the thing here is, of course, this is a very subjective thought. And like you rightly mentioned, it depends upon the asset owner and how they are planning. But the reason where I am coming from is we need to have baseline, and
Yeah.
our maturity level is continuously improving. It's on the flux. There are a lot of mergers and acquisitions, right?
Mhm.
And divestments as well. So all these are additional factors when we speak in terms of business of cyber, in terms of the corporate or board level. So these are some things that need to be factored in as well. And it's not hard and fast rule that you need to do multiple assessments or multiple audits, but unless you have a very good understanding of what is there, what's not there, and with various solutions like SOC, uh, probably that might be helpful. CM, that might be helpful as well. So with our regular audits and with our various technological solutions that are available, I think that the frequency can be more streamlined in terms of achieving the ROI.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Well, John, I've enjoyed this. We're almost at time. I think we've had great collaboration with the different folks on the kind of that are listening in that have been chatting with us. There's no doubt that audit and assessment are loaded words. There's a lot of differentiation from region to region and sector to sector. I think there's a lot of differentiation for IT versus OT, which we didn't even get into that. But
True.
the one thing that I did take away from this is that there doesn't appear to really be a wrong answer, right? As we look out there to the key stakeholders, whether asset owners, consultants, or product vendors, I think we all have a responsibility to talk about this a little bit more. So I appreciate you coming onto the show to talk about this and sharing your time. And I look forward to the next one. I'll pass back to you the last couple minutes to maybe articulate some final thoughts.
Yeah, I think it was really good discussion. Of course, we can always go on for another maybe a day. There's so much that we can speak. We have not even scratched the surface, and there are various technical constraints aspects that probably we didn't touch upon today because this was a short discussion. But my suggestion to the community and all the listeners and participants today, including you, Ted, would be when we are speaking about OT cybersecurity. Uh, there are few standards. Of course, IEC 62443 is something that is has become quite well known, and of course, it does touch about what an audit is, what an assessment is, and so on. But there is another standard that's quite overlooked, right? And it's called 61508, that talks about functional safety, and 61511 again about functional safety, but specific to oil and gas or process industry in general. uh, so these two standards, in addition to something called ISA 89, I think it's a must know, especially whether you're into audit or you're into assessment, or you're part of the team that is doing the audit, or if you're a stakeholder. That's all I'm saying. Do go through these standards. They offer a wealth of information that you can take away uh, on your everyday roles, and uh, ensure that maybe the assessor might be incorrect, maybe the auditor might be incorrect, but at least you are able to point out, okay, this is how it should be, and this is what we should be talking about. I just want to end with that.
Makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. And on behalf of the community, I want to thank you for your time today. You've been listening to the Business of Cyber: Audits versus Assessment, Audits or Assessments. This is a loaded word. I've been joined by John Kingsley from India, and I really appreciate his time and his expertise. Follow us at the Business of Cyber series for more information about connecting resources to your overall product plan and your overall security and maturity plan. My name is Ted. I'm your host, and I look forward to seeing you next week on Tuesday. Thanks for joining us.